وفاز شيعتنا ورب الكعبة والصلوات. فقال أبي رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله: يا علي والذي بعثني بالحق نبيا واستفاني بالرسالة نجيا، ما ذكر خبرنا هذا في محفل من محافل أهل الأرض، وفيه جمع من شيعتنا ومحبينا، وفيهم مهموم إلا وفرج الله حمه، ولا مغموم إلا وكشف الله غمه، ولا طالب حاجة إلا وقضى الله حاجته. فقال علي عليه السلام: إذا والله فزنا وسعدنا، وكذلك شيعتنا فازوا وسعدوا في الدنيا والآخرة ورب الكعبة. صلوات. I would like to request Dr. Sajid Kazmi to come in and take over the stage. Bawazi Buland Salawat.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Ladies and gentlemen, today is the second majlis which will be recited by Hujjatul Islam wal Muslimin Sayyid Mahdi Al-Modarresi. Before I invite Sayyid Zuriyab, just to share that such was the spirit of Shuhada in Karbala, that Hazrat Shahzad Ali Akbar asked Imam Hussain alayhi salam, are we not on righteous path? And Imam said, yes, we are on right path. And he said, then it doesn't make any difference if death approaches us or we approach death. That doesn't make difference. So such was the spirit of the people who were around our Imam. So for the love of Imam and my Alibad, loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Now I'll invite Sayyid Zuriyab to come and deliver his lecture in English. Wa Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, bulantar salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Sari digar salawat.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا وحبيبنا أبي القاسم مصطفى محمد اللهم صل على محمد وعلى بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين أما بعد فقد قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وآله وسلم فاطمة بضعة مني. First and foremost, we thank Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His infinite mercy, His blessings, in allowing us to hold this majalis yaza for Sayyidat Fatima al-Zahra. Salamullahi alayha. Carrying on from where we left yesterday, just the one short point regarding some of Sayyidah Fatima's fazila, some of her merits. We mentioned yesterday regarding Sayyidah Fatima that she's so special. We just discussed her door. In the sense that we find with Nabi Sulaiman and the likes of the angel of death, he comes through and he takes his soul, as mentioned in Surah Saba, verse 14, without the need for permission. That same angel of death comes to the house of Fatima in the Holy Prophet's final moments and is seen knocking. And so we find if the door of Fatima is like this, what must the essence of Fatima be like? Now, someone like me cannot explain the essence of someone like Sayyidah Fatima, who is known as Sirullah. We find, for example, the famous dua, Allahumma bihaqqi Fatima wa biha wa ba'liha wa baniha wa sirril mustawda'i fiha. Oh Allah, by Fatima's husband, her father, her children, and the secret which you have placed in her. But I would like to mention, in light of the works of our great scholars, some of the comparisons which give us a hint or a gist of what specialty this lady holds. For example, we find the famous hadith known as Hadith al-Qudsi, where it says Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala addresses the Holy Prophet saying, Lawlak ma khalaqtu aflak. O Holy Prophet, if it was not for you, I would not have made the creation. Walawla Ali ma khalaqtuka. If it was not for Ali ibn Abi Talib, I would not have created you. Walawla Fatima. ما خلقتكما. If it was not for Fatima, I would not have made the both of you. And scholars interpret this in many ways. We'll mention just one, that if it was not for the Holy Prophet, there would have been no one capable or worthy in their spirit and their presence in being the father of Sayyidah Fatima. If Imam Ali was not created, then there would have been no one worthy of asking for the hand of Sayyidah Fatima in marriage. So we find Sayyidah Fatima is not no ordinary woman. She holds a great importance. I would like to, before we finish, focus upon the Surah Qadr and its importance to Sayyidah Fatima. For example, we find in this holy surah, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Inna anzalnahu fi laylatil qadr. Indeed, we have sent the Quran on this night of power. It's referred to as Laylatul Qadr, and a very holy, auspicious night, and it's similar to Sayyidah's title, Sayyidatun Nisa. Just like how this night holds precedence over all other nights, Sayyidah Fatima, Sayyidatun Nisa al-Alameen, she holds precedence over all other women. Scholars go further. The surah mentions تَنَزَّلُ الْمَلَائِكَةُ وَالرُّوحُ فِيهَا. On this night, the angels descend. But scholars say, angels also visited Sayyidah Fatima. Indeed, one of her titles is what? Muhadditha, the one to whom the angels spoke. The angels are coming down on this one night. And my heart says, the angels would also see Fatima in her mihrab praying and come to so that they would converse with her. Hence her title, Al-Muhadditha. And it goes further. Scholars say, Qadr is a night we don't know. The Aimah alayhimus salam do, the Imams do, the Holy Infallibles do. It's one of three nights, the 19th, 21st, or the 23rd. Someone came to Imam Sadiq and says, you know which night it is. Can't you just explain to us? We'll pray for that one night. And Imam Sadiq very beautifully replied, it's three for a reason, so that you can make the most of your worship on these holy nights of the month of Ramadan throughout these 3 nights. But the main point for us is what? It's one of 3 nights. Come to Sayyidah Fatima, we don't know where she is buried today. It's one of 3 locations. Either if you go to Medina today, you ask the scholars, they say she's either buried in Jannatul Baqi, or in the Rawdah of Rasulullah, or in her own house. We find there's a secret around the night of Qadr, which the only Ma'sumeen know. Similarly, there's a secrecy or a high position in the grave of Sayyidah Fatima. One of 3 positions. It goes further. This night of Qadr is known as Laylatul Mubarakah, the blessed night. Sayyidah Fatima's title, another one of her titles is Al-Mubarakah. Scholars go even further. They say, on this night, the Holy Prophet would stand in prayer and worship, and he would explain to his companions and the Ummah, you also stand in prayer and worship. Similarly with Sayyidah Fatima, famous hadith, إِذَا دَخَلَتْ فَاطِمَةَ وَمَا إِلَيْهَا Muhammad. Whenever Fatima would enter, Salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ali. Not once, whenever Fatima would enter, the Prophet would stand up for her. He was seen doing this for no one else. And he would kiss her hands, kiss her on the forehead, and make her sit where he was sitting. He would do this for no one else. So we find the Prophet is encouraging people, stand on the night of Qadr, pray. It's a night of destiny. But when Fatima would come, the Holy Prophet is also standing for her and encouraging others to stand for her. And what is the essence of the night of Qadr? It could change your destiny. Similarly, scholars say, tawassal to Sayyidah Fatima can change your destiny. Look at the likes of Hur, the same boat as the likes of Shimr, Khuli, Ibn Sinan, all these wretched men. But his respect for Sayyidah Fatima changed his destiny. When he stopped the horse of Imam Hussein, I won't go into all of the details, Imam Hussein said what? May your mother sit in your grievance. What did Hur reply? Oh, Abu Abdullah, if any other man in the whole of Arabia said the same thing about my mother, he would know. Why? I would say something about his mother. But your mother is Fatima. How can I say anything about Fatima? And this is why they say on the night of Ashura, he can hear the kids crying and it affected him. It softened his heart. The others could hear the kids crying, no emotion. Why Hur? The likes of Sayyidah Fatima changed his destiny. We find in the 1970s, one of the great Marajas of the holy city of Najaf traveled to Karbala, visited Imam Hussein, then walked. Today, when you go to Karbala, may Allah allow all of us to go to Karbala, especially those who have not been. He walked from the haram of Imam Hussein to the shrine of Hur, who has his own maqam. And when he reached there, they said, "You are the Marja Taqleed. Why don't you rest for a bit?" He said, "No. That shrine inside, that man buried inside that shrine has the handkerchief of Fatima around his head." Indeed, this was a gift given to her by Imam Hussein. So we find Sayyidah Fatima can change our destiny as well. And the final point on this, Laylatul Qadr is how many hours? One part of the night, from the time of Maghrib all the way to the Fajr. A short time, but it held so much importance. Similarly, Sayyidah Fatima was only 18 years of age. A short time, but she left behind an ocean of legacy, of specialty, of spirituality. The night of Qadr, this holy Quran was revealed, but in the nights from Sayyidah Fatima and her progeny, we have 11 Imams which came, which were the speaking Quran. This is no coincidence. Sayyidah Fatima holds a very high position. And so the question begs, if this lady who was Sayyidatun Nisa, she owns all the riches, why was she after Fadak? And I'll mention just one line here. Someone asks, if she owns all this amount, she has such a high property, why is she going for Fadak? Ibn Abil Hadid, who is a famous Mu'tazili scholar, says, I asked my teacher, why did the Caliph not give Fatima her right? What was the issue? He knew everything was in her favor. He said, my teacher smiled. When your teacher smiles, it's one of two things. Either the question is good or the answer is going to be good. He said, I looked at my teacher, he smiled. I said, why are you smiling? He said, it was not about Fadak. He knew if I give Fadak to Fatima today, tomorrow she will come back with the right of Ali. And there will be no precedent for rejecting that. So Sayyidah Fatima knew in the sermon of Fadak itself, she only speaks about Fadak for some lines. It begins with the praise of Allah, ends with the praise of Allah, and has many other central themes involved. And so as we finish with today, we remember some of the musibah of this holy lady, this lady whose face emanated nur. That face left this world with bruises and cuts upon it. We find it narrated when the final moments of Sayyidah Fatima came, she gave everyone a wasiyah. There was one special wasiyah for Zainab. Oh Zainab, who's only 5 years old, there's a special wasiyah for you. We find 50 years later on the day of Ashura, when Imam Hussein comes to the Khaymaga for the final time, Zainab said, oh my brother, unbutton your collar for me. And she began kissing his holy neck. He said, Zainab, why did you kiss my neck? She replied, our mother Fatima told me in Medina, in her final wasiyah, when Hussein comes to meet you for the final time, kiss his neck from me, because here is where the blade will cut his skin and veins. But the Masahib did not stop there. When the janazah of Sayyidah Fatima is let out, Imam Ali calls all of the children. It is mentioned they all came to the chest of Sayyidah Fatima. They began hugging her and crying. And it is mentioned by Imam Ali alayhi salam that I could hear Fatima was also crying. But it is said at this moment the angels came down and said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, remove the likes of Hussein from the chest of Fatima. I would say, Ya Malaikatis Sama, you could not bear to see the likes of Hussein on the chest of Fatima. How did you bear to see the likes of Shimr sitting on the chest of Hussein? I would say, go ask the eyes of Zainab. She's standing there on Tillay Zainabiyah crying, Wa Muhammada, Wa Ghurbata, Wa Musibata, Wa Husayna, Wa Husayna, Wa Husayna. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. Sayya'lamu lazina zalamu ayyamun kalabiyan kalibun. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, by the right of Sayyidah Fatima, by her high maqam in the eyes of Allah, to accept our humble offering, to forgive us our sins, and to allow us to be with Sayyidah Fatima in this world and the hereafter. For the love of Sayyidah Fatima, if you can recite aloud, salawat.
MashaAllah, Zuriya. Before I invite Ahaz here, and he'll just be with us shortly, I'll again remind all of you that as I informed you yesterday, that the construction work is still going on for this Imam Baga, and it was possible with the help of all of you people which you contributed um, throughout this process when we were having this Imam Baga refurbished and reconstructed and all that. But still, right now, we need a lot of more of your cooperation. And for that, I will request all of you to kindly contribute by establishing the standing orders, and also you can contribute to Dr. Saab, and he has shared the QR code as well. You can use that, and that is for all of us, that for our future generations, that they will. Wa alaikum assalam. For Muhammad wa ali Muhammad bulantar salawat. So we are able to finish this construction work. It will be beneficial for all of us, for our community, and for our coming generations. We are very honored and we are very fortunate that we have with us Agha Sayyid Mahdi Modarresi, and with profound respect, I'll request Agha Sayyid Mahdi Modarresi to come on the stage. For Muhammad wa ali Muhammad bulantar salawat. Ali Muhammad.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم اللهم كن لوليك الحجة ابن الحسن صلواتك عليه وعلى آبائه في هذه الساعة وفي كل ساعة وليا وحافظا وقائدا وناصرا ودليلا وعينا حتى تسكنه أرضك طوعا وتمتعه فيها طويلا اللهم وهب لنا رأفته ورحمته وعونه ودعاءه وخيره ورضاه برحمتك يا أرحم الراحمين وصل اللهم على سيدنا محمد وآله الطاهرين اللهم صل على محمد وآل محمد. For the hastening of the reappearance of the Master, the Savior, the Avenger, the descendant of Fatima al-Zahra, Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan al-Askari, recite a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. To be blessed and become a recipient of the intercession of the mistress of the women of the world, Fatima al-Zahra. A louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. Every member of the household of purity and infallibility played many different roles and performed innumerable tasks that furthered the cause of God's religion and authority on this earth. They did many things that often overlapped with one another. However, every one of them played a central role that was unique to that individual. Whether it was to establish this fledgling religion and create a firm foundation for the faith that has been delivered by acting as a warner, as Amir al-Mu'mineen did to the people following the passing of the Holy Prophet. Or it was in the form of unmasking hypocrisy and revealing the true nature of evil, creating a distinction between the unadulterated, unsullied religion of God and the counterfeit version created by evil in order to combat and replace it. Or it was perhaps to rise up against oppressive tyrants, or perhaps to educate and teach the masses. Or it was in the form of delivering the religious and juristic laws of God, expanding and extrapolating on the verses of the Holy Quran. Or it was to teach us how to supplicate to Allah, how to perform the most sublime version of worship. All of these roles were allocated to each member of the Ahlul Bayt in their own unique ways, their own exceptional circumstances, and depending on the conditions of their day, the Imams of the Ahlul Bayt performed their tasks and furthered God's agenda on earth. That's not to say that they didn't do other things, but it would be a mistake and a grave act of injustice if someone tried to speak about, let's say, the sixth Imam by talking about his acts of worship, his sincerity. Not that the worship of the sixth Imam wasn't the greatest at the time. Not that it wasn't exceptional and unique in every conceivable way. But you see how it would be an act of injustice to speak about the fifth Imam or the sixth Imam without talking about the fact that they extrapolated God's knowledge and delivered it to the people. So, keeping that principle in mind, which has been elucidated in numerous traditions of the Ahlul Bayt as well. For instance, Hadith Al-Lawh Al-Mahfuz, a famous narration which reports that a tablet was delivered to the Holy Prophet and was later shared with the commander of the faithful and Fatima al-Zahra, on which the names of the Imams was mentioned and each of their specific unique roles was also referenced. So this is not just something that we are able to deduce by studying and examining the biography of the Ahlul Bayt, but rather something that's been specifically mentioned in numerous traditions. Having said all of that, what was the role of Fatima al-Zahra? Of course, we can sit down and talk about how she was an exemplar of the perfect wife. Without a doubt, we can learn lessons and be inspired by the life of Fatima az-Zahra in how she treated her husband, Amir al-Mu'mineen, with the utmost respect and adoration. Of course, we can try and deduce lessons on child rearing and discipline from her life. But you see how it would be a grave injustice if we confined her role to these matters, which, as important as they are peripheral in comparison to her unique role. Can we talk about environmentalism in Islam? Of course we can. Are there no teachings or instructions in the legacy and heritage of the Holy Prophet and the infallible Imams that provide guidelines on how to look after the environment and ensure that environmental decline does not take place? Of course there are. But is that a top priority? This is almost like saying that when the 12th Imam comes, the Imam will make groceries free of charge. You will no longer have to pay your electricity bill. You see how this would be an injustice to the mission, the divine mandate of Al-Hujjat ibn al-Hasan, arwahuna lahu al-fida. You understand how this misses the point. Again, to speak about Imam al-Hussein alayhi salam within the context of social justice isn't wrong. If somebody sat on the pulpit and said that I would like to address the social justice component in the mission of Imam al-Hussein, which is one of hundreds of other dimensions in his mission, I would say, may Allah bless you. Keep going. Do speak. But if someone says to you that Imam al-Hussein stood up for social justice, what they're suggesting is that his central mission was to further the cause of social justice, which is a grave injustice in itself. If someone says that Imam al-Hussein rose for the sake of equality and equity, this would be an injustice to Imam al-Hussein. This looks at Imam al-Hussein through a very narrow lens, and in doing so, does not present the mission of the Imam in its accurate form. Who said Imam al-Hussein rose up to fight racism, for instance? Yes, racism is evil. Yes, racism is antithetical to the teachings of our faith. But to say that Imam al-Hussein was actually trying to eradicate racist attitudes from society is a big mistake. It trivializes the mission of Imam al-Hussein. It makes it seem tiny and small and minuscule. Imam al-Hussein rose up for the sake of Allah, to establish belief in Allah. وَبَذَلَ مُهْجَتَهُ فِيك. He gave the blood of his heart in your way. Why? To eradicate racism. Well, that might be a part of his mission, yes. One of dozens of dimensions. Oppression, injustice, all that is true. But is that the reason he did what he did and sacrificed the most precious things for the sake of what? So that we could have a democratic government? وَبَذَلَ مُهْجَتَهُ فِيكَ لِيَسْتَنْقِذَ عِبَادَكَ مِنَ الْجَهَالَةِ وَحَيْرَةِ الضَّلَالَةِ. He's trying to provide guidance. In other words, bear with me. I know this might be a little bit dry and dense. Let's imagine, for argument's sake, that Yazid was a just ruler. Meaning that he didn't kill anyone, he didn't oppress anyone, he didn't incarcerate anyone. Would Imam al-Hussein not rise? Or would he absolutely rise? In fact, we all know that hypocrisy is a much bigger threat and evil than outright disbelief. If Yazid and his predecessors acted as though they were pious, it would make them more dangerous, not less. So going back to the question of Fatima az-Zahra, had the coup leaders who assumed power following the passing of the Holy Messenger of God been people who didn't care about money whatsoever, let's say they didn't confiscate the land of Fadak. Let's say, in fact, that they donated all of their possessions to the Muslim treasury. Would Fatima az-Zahra not take the stance that she took? Of course she would. Because the face of hypocrisy is more worthy of being unmasked and revealed than the face of someone who unabashedly and shamelessly commits these atrocities and crimes. Because their agenda, remember, as I said last night, was to restore Jahiliyyah. Their agenda was to remove God from the equation. It wasn't just about oppression, injustice, racism, and these sorts of things, which have now become trending. And so every Muslim man or woman, especially those of us who are younger and passionate and energetic, mashallah, we have this woke generation. Again, social justice is absolutely important. Please understand what I'm saying. Racism is absolutely evil. Oppression is absolutely demonic. But there are things much, much more important than these. What was the role of Fatima az-Zahra? In a nutshell, and I want you to keep this in mind. In a nutshell, it was to break the consensus. Allow me to elaborate. Had it not been for Fatima alayhi salam, the narrative that would have reached us would have been what the majority of Muslims now believe. Speak to anyone who follows the school of Khilafah and tell them what happened after the death of the Prophet. What do they say? They say there was a meeting. The top lieutenants of the Prophet, the most worthy contenders, the most noble companions gathered around, assembled. They engaged in a very civilized debate. They deliberated about who should succeed the Prophet. They all agreed on a particular candidate. When that candidate became the successor, the heir, the Khalifa, everyone submitted. It was all rainbows and butterflies. This is the narrative, isn't it? Fatima az-Zahra, his greatest contribution was to destroy this consensus. In other words, Fatima, her name, her land, her trial, her statements, her sermon, her grave, everything about her screams there was no consensus. Don't be fooled. Don't swallow the lie that's been fed to you. There was never a consensus. It wasn't rainbows and butterflies. It wasn't hunky-dory. It was a coup. It was the most vile, savage form of a coup d'etat. It involved aggression. It involved violence. It involved savagery. There was never a consensus. And that's what Fatima does. Introducing her into the equation, bringing her into the conversation, immediately destroys the consensus. This whole rosy picture of loving companions, deliberating, respectfully disagreeing, ultimately coming together, creating a unanimous decision as to who should lead, becomes a filthy, hideous, grotesque, repulsive lie. And that's really all you need. Because once you destroy the consensus, once you shatter that glass facade, the facade of faith and piety, suddenly piety is no longer part of the equation. It becomes a Game of Thrones. It becomes a political maneuver at the very least. And that was the central role of Fatima that was unique to her. No one else could have done that. Not even Amir al-Mu'mineen. To the point where when the two come to Amir al-Mu'mineen and say to him, why didn't you call us? Why did you bury her without alerting us? Because even Sunni scholars have said this, that the only one that was capable of leading Salatul Janazah on Fatima al-Zahra was the Khalifa. How could the daughter, the only surviving child of Rasulullah, die, but the Khalifa isn't even invited? What does that tell you about the relationship? What does that tell you about that fake facade of piety? What does that tell you about the alleged consensus? So he said to Amir al-Mu'mineen, why didn't you invite us? What did the Imam say? He said, Wallahi laqad awsatni an la tahdara janazataha aw as-salat alayha. By God, she instructed me, she specifically told me not to allow you to. It's not about all Muslims. Yes, all Muslims suffer. And they're deprived of the privilege of being in attendance at the time of the burial of their prophet's daughter. They're all deprived of that honor because of these two. It was about them. You're the ones who are being disinvited. You're the ones who are not supposed to be witnesses to that day and that moment. Wallahi laqad awsatni. By God, you told me not to invite you. I'm not playing games here. I'm being honest and frank. He responded to Amir al-Mu'mineen in a way that is so derogatory, I can't even mention it on the minbar. دعك من هذه الهمهمة. Then he made a threat. Let's not go there. Fatima al-Zahra broke this consensus through her burial. She broke that consensus through the fact that her burial took place at night. How do you explain that? How do you try to justify أنها ماتت وهي واجدة? As Bukhari quotes Aisha as saying, ماتت وهي واجدة على أبي بكر. He died while in the state of anger against him. How do you explain that? So, not a rosy picture. It's not some peaceful transition of power. It's not a democratic process where it's all rainbows and butterflies. It was something much more sinister than that. That's what Fatima al-Zahra did. Now, I would like to take permission, first of all, from the scholars, may Allah bless them, who have blessed this gathering. May Fatima al-Zahra reward them and everyone else here. And mention a specific event. But before I do that, it's important that we talk about a subject that has recently, in my view, become more and more troubling and relevant. And that is the issue of, again, passionate, energetic, young brothers and sisters who try to dip their toes into areas that are outside the fold of their expertise. Let's establish a concept here, a principle, and that is that in the Quran, in the traditions of the Ahlul Bayt, the role of preaching and inviting others to our cause by means of getting involved in polemical debates has been confined to people with expertise in the field. وَلْتَكُنْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala speaks about those who are tasked with enjoining the good and forbidding evil, at least on a communal scale. فَلَوْلَا نَفَرَ مِنْ كُلِّ فِرْقَةٍ مِّنْهُمْ طَائِفَةٌ. Every community should isolate a group of them who would go seek knowledge of religion and then come back. وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَ لِيَتَفَقَّهُوا فِي الدِّينِ وَلِيُنذِرُوا قَوْمَهُمْ إِذَا رَجَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ لَعَلَّهُمْ يَحْذَرُونَ. So, it is confined to a select group of people. What? Which task? The task of engaging in religious arguments, in polemical debates. What they call, at least in the Christian faith, apologetics, right? This is not something that everyone should be engaged in. Why? I've discussed this at length in a series of classes in our online hawza. I don't want to bore you with the details. It is a class after all, which means that it is not exactly things that I'm well aware, not things that you would perhaps find suitable for a minbar. However, I'll mention just a couple of points. Imam al-Baqir, alayhi salatu wassalam, Allahumma salli. He says to one of his companions by the name of Ziyad, قال أبو جعفر يا زياد إياك والمخاصمات فإنها تورث الشك. One of the negative side effects of engaging in these kinds of speaker's corner type of arguments and polemical debates, one of their side effects is that they lead to doubt. They make the untrained, unskilled polemicists, the one who engages in these discussions, they cause cracks in their creed. How? You go to these places, first of all, the intention, even if you do this online, by the way, it doesn't have to happen physically or face to face. Even online debates, even debates with your friends. A debate by nature is aggressive. A debate by nature isn't designed primarily, maybe secondarily, but not primarily. It's not designed to invite the other side to the truth. Rather, it's designed to break their arguments. It is to defeat them in the debate. Because by nature these polemical debates are aggressive, they often don't lead to any good results, meaning that most of the time nobody ends up being convinced of the other party's arguments. It simply becomes a shouting match and it leads to nothing of value whatsoever. In addition to that, if you are going on the offensive to attack someone and defend your belief, defend your faith, then you should of course expect them to reciprocate the attacks. Obviously, they're not going to sit idly by and wait for you to attack them. They will do the same thing to you. Now, because the person is untrained, because they're unskilled, because they don't have the natural and necessary intellectual foundations, they will also be injured. You're injuring the other side, you're also getting injured. For example, one of the things it leads to is this defeatist apologetic mentality. For example, he says to you that you say that our books have this hadith, what about your books which have this hadith? Right? That's usually how it works. What's our natural inclination and response? No. We don't believe that all the hadiths in our books are authentic. You have sahihs, we don't have sahihs. Immediately, I've made concessions for no good reason. You see what I've just done here? I have rejected our hadiths simply on the basis of the fact that I'm unable to defend those ahadith. Not because they're not authentic, not because they have a weak chain of transmission, but because this untrained individual is unable to make sense of that hadith or unable to convince the other side that the hadith is in fact authentic. and logical and so forth, we are forced into a corner. We're compelled into rejecting those ahadith. No, we don't have sahihs. Says who? Who says that? The only sahih book is the holy book of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So if I wrote a book, 500 pages, in which I said Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala exists, the Holy Prophet was sent, the Prophet had appointed successors. If this is all I said, you'd still say, no, this book is not correct. The only book that is authentic and correct is the Holy Quran. What is this defeatist mentality that we have? This apologetic approach that we develop simply because we're not trained for the task. We end up being pushed into a corner and we find ourselves having to offer unnecessary and even dangerous concessions on the part of our faith. Who gave you the right to do this? Who put you in that position to be a spokesperson for Tashayyu' and Islam? How dare you reject a hadith when the Holy Prophet says, إِذَا جَاءَكُمُ الْحَدِيثُ مِنْ آلِ مُحَمَّدٍ فَاطْمَأَنَّتْ لَهُ قُلُوبُكُمْ. If you hear a hadith that you feel comfortable with, that sits well within you, فَاقْبَلُوهُ, accept it. وَإِذَا جَاءَكُمُ الْحَدِيثُ عَنْ آلِ مُحَمَّدٍ فَاشْمَأَزَّتْ مِنْهُ قُلُوبُكُمْ فَلَا فَرُدُّوهُ إِلَى اللَّهِ وَإِلَى رَسُولِهِ وَإِلَى الْعَالِمِ مِنْ آلِ مُحَمَّدٍ وَلَا تَقُولُوا مَا كَانَ هَذَا وَمَا كَانَ هَذَا. And if you hear a hadith, if something reaches you that doesn't quite sit well with your flawed logic and your untrained mind is unable to process it, you have no right to reject it. The Holy Prophet then says, for if you do, فَإِنَّ الْإِنْكَارَ هُوَ الْكُفْرِ. If you reject this hadith based on what I just described, the fact that this person simply doesn't have the education or the intellectual backing to process this hadith and to examine this hadith, the Prophet says, فَإِنَّ الْإِنْكَارَ هُوَ الْكُفْرِ. Rejecting it is an act of disbelief. At the very least, it is the first step into disbelief. Why is it that our youth, may Allah bless them, I know they have pure intentions, I know they're trying to do the right thing, but why is it that they feel that they're entitled to an opinion on these highly complex matters? Who gave them this right? Oh, but I've read a lot of books. That's like someone saying, here's a medication to treat your cancer. And even though I'm not qualified, I'm not a doctor, but I have read a lot of Wikipedia articles on the matter. So I did allocate a good chunk of my time. And so I feel like I'm qualified right now. In fact, so qualified that I can engage in debates with other scholars, other doctors. You see how pathetic this is, how childish this is, and more importantly, how detrimental and dangerous this is. So, this defeatist mentality is a big mistake. Or, as I said in the hadith of Imam al-Baqir, the Imam highlights something even more dangerous. He says that these mukhasamat, meaning these polemical discussions, these debates, إِيَّاكَ وَالْمُخَاصَمَاتِ فَإِنَّهَا تُورِثُ الشَّكِّ. They lead to doubt. They lead to misconceptions. Because it's a war. Any polemical debate is a war, except it's an intellectual type of war. And no holds are barred. The other side quotes this hadith, which you've never even read, let alone understood or processed. And what happens to you is at first you try to justify. Then, if you're unable to justify, you'll reject. And then this will lead to a crack in the wall. And all a dam requires is a crack for it to come crumbling down, destroying the entire town. Have we not seen people abandon the faith altogether because they entered into this field while they were unqualified? How many examples do we need to see before we recognize that this is a specialized subject? It has its own rules, its own institutions, its own teachers, its own scholars, its own experts. How many? Imam al-Sadiq alayhi salam is sitting with his companions. when somebody walks in and decides to debate with the Imam, so the Imam allows his companions to address his questions and misconceptions. Each one tries to rebut that individual's argument in their own way. Imran ibn A'yan, Muhammad ibn Muslim, Hisham ibn al-Hakam, and others. Each one attempts to use their own skills, their own tricks in order to respond to these questions. When they were done, the Imam addressed each one of them, and he began to highlight their mistakes. One of them, the Imam said to him, you shouldn't get involved in polemics. You shouldn't dip your toe into this field because it's just not, you're not cut out for it. The other, the Imam says to him, إِنَّكَ تَرُدُّ بَاطِلًا بِبَاطِلٍ. Yes, you're responding to the falsehood that was presented, but you used falsehood to respond to falsehood. You have no right to do that. The other one, and so on, until the Imam says to Hisham ibn al-Hakam that you should specialize in this field. You're the one who's capable of doing this. Not even the companions of the Imam who were scholars in their own right. And yet now, every random person who can type a tweet thinks that they're capable of engaging in these things. Who told you you're supposed to do that? Read the chapter, Kitab al-Taqiyya, in the blessed book of Al-Kafi, so you know that there is a time and a place for these discussions. Unlike these da'wah thugs that you see them on the street going around, roaming, trying to basically convert all of humanity into their own twisted religion, we have no such instructions. Do you know what we've been instructed? It's the most difficult means of da'wah. كونوا دعاة لأنفسكم بغير ألسنتكم. You know how sometimes you have these games where they tell you that you need to race each other, but you're not allowed to run freely. You have to put your legs in a bag, and then we'll see who gets to run faster. They take away one of your faculties and say, now let's see how good you are. Imam as-Sadiq is telling us, you want to invite people to your cause, to your faith, to your religion? Let's take away your tongues. Use your actions. You see how beautiful this is? You see how this develops us even before it converts anybody else? You see how this turns us into angelic beings? Because we have to live the teachings of Islam. We have to practice before we preach. بِغَيْرِ أَلْسِنَتِكُمْ. Let's see how good you are. And if you do that, believe you me, brothers and sisters, O followers of Ja'far ibn Muhammad as-Sadiq, if you follow this advice of the Imam, you will end up with a much more meaningful process of conversion. You will invite people to the cause of the Ahlul Bayt en masse in the most beautiful manner. Who said that you're supposed to go out there and convert everyone and invite everyone and debate with everyone? Let me give you one example. This was the introduction to this particular example that I want to cite, which has to do with the mission of Fatima to Zahra. There's only one hadith about the virtues of Fatima in Al-Bukhari. I don't know how many there are in praise of other women and other men and so forth, but the first slap across the Shia faith is the fact that the chapter that speaks about the merits and virtues of Fatima to Zahra in Sahih al-Bukhari is at the very end of Kitab Fadl al-Sahaba, the book on the virtues of the companions. Fatima is one of them. We'll let that go. Only one hadith. The Prophet's beloved daughter. There's only one quote that is about her virtues. Fine. Have you actually read the hadith? What does it actually say? Because you might be wondering, why would Bukhari even include a hadith that speaks of the virtues of Fatima to Zahra, knowing his attitude towards the Ahlul Bayt, knowing that his heart was filled with disease. إِنَّ فِي الْقَلْبِ مِنْ جَعْفَرٍ شيء. Why would he even include this hadith? Well, when you read it, it becomes clear. The hadith says the following: خطب علي ابنة أبي جهل. Ali ibn Abi Talib asked the hand of the daughter of Abu Jahl in marriage. He proposed to her. So the Fatima Zahra became angry. She informed the Prophet. Rasulullah said, فاطمة بضعة مني من آذاها فقد آذاني ومن أغضبها فقد أغضب. In other words, the context of the hadith is what? That Amirul Mu'mineen angered Fatima. So who angered Rasulullah? It was Ali ibn Abi Talib. So that's the context. Now, I'm engaged in a discussion with a particular individual from the other school, the school of the Sunnah of Khilafah. And I brought up this issue. This is about 22 years ago. And he said to me, I said, look at this lie, this allegation against Amir al-Mu'mineen. And we have many, many responses, by the way, to this, exposing this concoction about Amir al-Mu'mineen trying to propose to the daughter of Abu Jahl when he's married to Fatima Zahra. يظهر نورها لأهل السماوات. Fatima, for whom all of those companions queued up for the honor of proposing to her and were rejected and thrown out. Amir al-Mu'mineen needs to marry someone else, the daughter of Abu Jahl, no less. So anyway, we're having this discussion. Then he says to me, but you do know that this hadith exists in your own books, right? Again, put yourself in my position with no training, no education in this field. What is your reaction? What is it? Rubbish, lie. Or, in the best case scenario, look, at the end of the day, our books contain all manner of things. Bihar al-Anwar is the oceans, and in the ocean you find sharks, and you find fish, and you find pearls, and you find garbage. This kind of defeatist, apologetic, pathetic form of argument. He said, you have a version of the hadith in your own books. Where? Al-Kafi. Of all books, the blessed book of Al-Kafi. So I immediately looked up the reference. I found the hadith. Sure enough, he's right. What does the hadith say? Someone came to Imam al-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi. He said to him, Ya ibn Rasulillah, I have a question. It involves matters of jurisprudence, fiqh. The question is, can a person be buried at night while we hold lanterns? In other words, we can still see. Are we allowed to bury a dead person in the night, or should we wait until daylight? So the Imam put his head down for a few seconds. Then he raised head back up again. He was crying and tears were rolling down his cheek. The Imam said, كانت لنا أم. We had a mother. You reminded me of her. The Imam then said, listen carefully. جاء شقي من الأشقياء إلى فاطمة. A wicked man came to Fatima. We don't know who this person is, but he came to Fatima Zahra. And he told her, إن عليا قد خطب ابنة أبي جهل. Ali has proposed to the daughter of Abu Jahl and he wants to marry her. فغضبت فاطمة. Fatima became angry. She was enraged. What does she do? She took her two children, Al-Hasan and Al-Hussein. She held Imam Al-Hussein, hadith says, in her arm, and she grabbed the hand of Imam Al-Hasan and she went straight to her father's home. When a woman is mistreated by her husband, who does she turn to? To her father. So she went to the house of Rasulullah. She looked for him. The Prophet wasn't there. She then went to the masjid looking for Rasulullah. When she got there, Rasulullah was surrounded by some of his companions. He had a circle around him. She did not wish to interrupt the Holy Prophet. So she simply stood at the door of the masjid for a while so that the Prophet would notice her. When the Prophet noticed her, he finished, but she had already left, so the Prophet went to her home. When she told him what had happened, Rasulullah took her children and his daughter, and he went to his own house in protest and in anger. Amir al-Mu'mineen, meanwhile, comes back to his house. He sees that his wife and children are missing. What does he do? The Imam simply goes back to the masjid, puts his head on a pile of sand, and falls asleep. Rasulullah waits until it's nighttime. He then grabs his daughter's hand and his grandchildren's, goes to the masjid to find Amir al-Mu'mineen sleeping there. So the Prophet shook him with his feet and said to him, "Qum ya Ali, فَكَمْ مِن نَائِمٍ أَزْعَجْتَهُ." Ali, wake up. How many people who were sleeping comfortably you awakened? Get up. Amir al-Mu'mineen wakes up. The Prophet said to him, "Go bring me Abu Bakr and Umar. I want them to be witnesses here." So he goes and he finds them. He brings them from their homes. They come. The Holy Prophet then addresses Ali ibn Abi Talib. Again, all of this is in Al-Kafi. He says to him, "Man arafa hadhihi faqad arafaha wa man lam ya'rifha fa innaha Fatimatu bintu Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa alihi." Whoever knows this, so be it. Whoever doesn't know her, doesn't recognize her, you should know who this is. This is my daughter. Man آذاها فقد آذاني ومن أغضبها فقد أغضبني. The Prophet said this to Amir al-Mu'mineen. How do you justify this? How? Let me take you back to the very beginning. What did the Prophet say? What did Imam al-Sadiq, say? He said, جاء تقي من الأشقياء. A wicked man came to Fatima. Why does the Imam describe him as shaqi? Again, this highlights, my dear brothers and sisters, that this is a delicate subject, that these are specialist subjects. If you're going to enter this field and you have pure intentions to serve the cause of the Ahlul Bayt and to defend the right of Fatima, if you wish to be a scholar, then be a scholar. Don't be everything else with an asterisk that says, I also debate people. I go to Speaker's Corner, I go online, and I do these things when you're not skilled or qualified. Notice, the Imam first of all says that a wicked man came and said to Fatima that Ali has proposed to the daughter of Abu Jahl. Fatima became angry, yes, not at Ali, but at the wicked man. Then Fatima goes to her father. All of those things transpire. All of this, if you're thinking about this in the context of Amir al-Mu'mineen actually proposing to the daughter of Abu Jahl, then all of this anger would be directed at who? At Amir al-Mu'mineen. But it has nothing to do with Amir al-Mu'mineen. Which is why Rasulullah says to the Imam, this is a domestic dispute at the end of the day. It's a problem at worst, if we're going by this narrative. It's a problem between husband and wife and the father of the wife. Why would the Prophet bring Abu Bakr and Umar into this? Why involve total strangers in a domestic dispute? Had it not been for the fact that it begins to shed light on who that wicked man was. The Prophet brings them. Now, the only part that you might be hesitant about is how the Prophet awakened Amir al-Mu'mineen. Why would the Prophet wake him up with his feet? But that begins to make sense when you realize that I would put the Prophet's feet over my head, the blessed feet of Rasulullah. It's not an insult for this man, the best of creation, to use it in order to awaken Amir al-Mu'mineen, especially knowing that the hadith itself says that Rasulullah was holding Imam al-Hussein. Then he says to him, how many people's sleep have you disturbed? stand up. Of course, Amirul Mu'mineen disturbed their sleep. Of course, Ali ibn Abi Talib, it is his pride that he disturbed the evildoers and the oppressors and the tyrants and the pagans. So this is not an insult. Once again, context matters. So Rasulullah brings those two and says, Man arafa hadihi faqad arafaha, to the rest of the hadith. Guess who went around as soon as daybreak the next day to tell everyone what Rasulullah had said? Who became the narrator of this hadith? That whoever hurts my daughter hurts me, and whoever angers her angers me. It was in fact Abu Bakr and Umar, because they saw this as an opportunity. Here, Rasulullah is accusing Ali ibn Abi Talib. The plot worked, the lie stuck. So they became the reporters of this hadith, which is why when they came to the house of Fatima, asking permission to enter upon her, Fatima az-Zahra at first refused to let them in, which is to make another stance and expose their relationship with her. Then Amirul Mu'mineen asks and intercedes that she allows them to come in after they insisted. Fatima az-Zahra responds by saying what? He says, Al-baytu baytuk, wal-hurratu zawjatuk, or according to other reports, wal-hurratu amatuk. The house is your house, Ya Abul Hasan, and this maid is your wife. You can do whatever you wish. She gives Amirul Mu'mineen, she does this, let's call it a favor, and I'll explain why. You're asking me for a favor, I'll do it for your sake. They come in, they say salam, Fatima refuses to respond to them. They sit down, Fatima turns as painful as it was. She turns to the other side. They even change their position just so they could have an audience, so they could create that fake facade of piety, so they could try and rebuild that consensus which has been shattered beyond repair by Fatima herself, so that they could say that we went and asked her for forgiveness and she forgave us. So they come, they try to speak. What does Fatima say? She says to them, Ya Ali salhuma. Doesn't even address them. Ya Abul Hasan, ask them in God's name. I want to ask them a question and I want them to be truthful. If they answer me, I will then respond to them. Ask them, did they not hear my father say, فاطمة بضعة مني من آذاها فقد آذاني ومن أغضبها فقد أغضبني. They couldn't say no because they were the reporters of the hadith. They had no choice but to acknowledge the fact that they heard the Prophet say this loud and clear, which is why they said, Na'am wallah nashhad anna qad sami'nah. By God, we bear witness that we heard your father say that. That's the point when Fatima az-Zahra says, if that is the case, Allahumma fashhad annahuma qad aghdabani. Oh God, be my witness, they angered me. Oh God, be my witness that they hurt me. Oh God, be my witness that they angered Rasulullah in the process. A condemnation like no other. They're done. They're done. Case closed. They get up and leave. Then she looks at Amirul Mu'mineen. She says to him, Ya Abul Hasan, I obeyed you when you asked them, when you interceded so that they could come into the house. فَهَلْ أَنْتَ مُطِيعٌ مَا آمُرُكَ? Can I now command you and you will obey me? Allah. Imam al-Baqir alayhi salam says that فاطمة مفترضة الطاعة على خلق الله أجمعين. The word of Fatima is obligatory. She must be obeyed. Do you know who you crushed between the wall and the door? Do you know whose cries you caused to erupt as she was crushed? He said to him, Ya Abul Hasan, I obeyed you there. Would you obey my instructions? Amir al-Mu'mineen said, of course, Ya bint Rasulullah. She responded, do not let them attend my funeral. Don't let them come to my burial. That's why nobody came. Imam al-Baqir says the number of people who attended the burial of Fatima was only 7 individuals. 7 people, which included the household. Allahu Akbar. You know, it's truly heartrending when you think about how strange and how tragic and how bizarre and how shocking the burial of all of the Imams was. Rasulullah didn't even have a burial because they were too busy slicing up that cake among them. Amir al-Mu'mineen was buried at night, and once again, people didn't participate. His grave was to be concealed for the next 150 years, right? Imam al-Hasan had a burial, but a burial that I wish he never had. بِأَبِي هُوَ وَأُمِّي. 70 arrows were plucked from his body when his brothers Al-Hussein, Al-Abbas were lowering him into his grave. As for Aba Abdullah Al-Hussein, مَا غَسَّلُوهُ وَمَا لَفُّوهُ فِي كَفَنٍ. Instead of a proper burial, they called out, عَلَيَّ بِالْجِيَادِ الْأَعْوَجِيَّةِ. Get me those 10 fresh horses. As for Fatima al-Zahra, there was no burial. According to some reports, Fatima al-Zahra was buried in her own home, which means it was simply a burial. In her last will, Fatima says this. She says, Ya Abul Hasan, first, don't let them attend my funeral. Don't let them witness my prayers, meaning Salatul Janazah. And Ya Abul Hasan, I wish for you, غسلني ليلا وادفني وحنطني ليلا وادفني ليلا. Ya Abul Hasan, bathe my body at night, enshroud me at night, and bury me at night. Now, some have said that it makes sense for Fatima to want to be buried at night because she doesn't want others to attend. She doesn't want them to come and restore that shattered consensus and claim that they had no problems with Fatima. It makes perfect sense. Fatima al-Zahra did that so that her children and her children's children and her followers and her lovers until the day of judgment know the oppression that she was subjected to. Know that it was nothing but pure evil that stood in her way. This is an enduring symbol of the oppression of Fatima. This makes perfect sense. But then she says something to Amir al-Mu'mineen which doesn't add up. She says, Ya Abul Hasan, when you are washing my body, wash it from above my clothes. Don't take my clothes off. Now Amir al-Mu'mineen is the husband of Fatima fi dunya wal akhirah. Why would she say that? They say that this part was for the sake of Ali ibn Abi Talib himself. بِأَبِي هُوَ وَأُمِّي يَا أَوَّلَ مَظْلُوم. Why? Remember, if we ever fall, the first thing we say is what? We say, Ya Ali. If we trip over, we say, Ya Ali. If we need help, we say, Ya Ali. And yet, even though Ali is the greatest rock on whom we all rely, when Fatima fell, she didn't call out his name. She said, Ya Fidda ilayki fahmilini. Oh Fidda, I want you to come and hold me. فَقَدْ وَاللَّهَ أَسْقَطُوا مَا فِي أَحْشَائِي. Why? Because Fatima doesn't want Ali to know what just happened to her. She's protecting Amir al-Mu'mineen from this grief. Ammar ibn Yasir says that Amir al-Mu'mineen sometimes would simply burst into tears and cry in pain for Fatima. So I said to him one day, I said, Ya Amir al-Mu'mineen, sometimes we see you crying so bitterly. Why is that? What is it that you remember? Amir al-Mu'mineen said to him, لما حملت فاطمة ووضعتها على المغتسل. When I carried Fatima and put her on the bathing rock, كانت كالشبح. Fatima had no weight. Amir al-Mu'mineen could easily carry her. She was nothing but skin and bones at that point. He says, when I placed her on the bathing rock, وضعت يدي. Amir al-Mu'mineen put his hand, even though it was from behind the clothes. He says, as I was washing her, he came across a rib He found a recess in the chest of Fatima. Fatima al-Zahra says to Fidda, they have killed my infant. But there is another infant that was killed in Karbala. When Abu Abdullah took his 6-month-old, the mother went back. She went back to the tent. Normally, you know that if a child is dying, if a child is sick, who is the one that runs around? Who is the one that asks for help? It is the mother, isn't it? Why is it that the mother goes back into the tent? Because if the child is dying of thirst, she doesn't want to see the shame on the face of Abu Abdullah. Imam al-Hussein comes back and the child has been slaughtered from ear to ear. Ya Abu Abdullah. A poet describes this scene. She says that the mother might have looked outside. She spoke to her infant, saying that when I was ready to wean you, to stop breastfeeding you, I was thinking of how I would do that, but I never thought that the thing that stops you from breastfeeding is this 3-pronged arrow. Imagine on the day of Ashura, when they came, they were about to leave the camp. They came, Rubab comes out. She says to Lady Zainab, she says to him, oh my lady, didn't you tell me that Abu Abdullah buried my son behind the tent? She said, yes. Didn't you tell me that the Imam himself made sure that he was buried? Yes, he did. Then why do I see his head on a long spear? لا حول ولا قوة إلا بالله العلي العظيم. إنا لله وإنا إليه راجعون. وسيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون والعاقبة للمتقين. إلهنا بفاطمة وأبيها وبعلها وبنيها والسر المستودع فيها، عجل اللهم فرج إمام زماننا يا الله. اللهم اجعلنا من أصحابه وأعوانه ومقوية سلطانه. عجل اللهم لوليك الفرج والعافية والنصر. اللهم ارزقنا في الدنيا زيارة الحسين وفي الآخرة شفاعة الحسين. اللهم أحيني حياة محمد وآل محمد وأمتني ممات محمد وآل محمد، ولا تفرق بيننا وبينهم طرفة عين أبدا. اللهم وارحم موتانا وموتى المؤمنين العلماء الصالحين خدمة أبي عبد الله الحسين ومن لا يذكرهم ذاكر، إلى أرواحهم وأرواح الماضين من هذا الجمع نهدي ثواب المجلس وثواب السورة المباركة الفاتحة مع الصلوات.
فاطمة يا فاطمة، فاطمة يا فاطمة، فاطمة يا فاطمة، يا فاطمة زهراء. فاطمة 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 يا فاطمة، يا فاطمة زهراء. فاطمة 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 يا فاطمة، يا فاطمة زهراء. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Voices Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Fatima, Fatima. Fatima, ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima. Hey, our hearts so hollow, our hearts so hollow, our joy is sorrow. They say bright days after dark nights follow, but how can light follow today's night tomorrow, when the lantern of the world is but a shadow? Oh, Fatima, but your light will forever glow. Oh, Fatima, but your light will forever glow. Oh, our tears for your loss will forever flow. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Fatima, Fatima, Fatima. Voices, brothers. Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Our smiles turn to frowns, our smiles turn to frowns, our ups turn to downs, our hope mixes with our tears and drowns. You are the sweetest now that will always resound, and your hijab, your highness, was your crown. Free are the servants that served under your highness. Free, you are the unseen proof of God's oneness. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima Zahra. Time stood still for time, time stood still for time, saying, oh, what a crime. The night took one look at you and turned blind. How can the undefined, how can the undefined injure the most divine? How can her ribs between the door and nail confine? Oh, are you mourning for Muhsin or for your pain? Oh, are you mourning for Muhsin or for your pain? Oh, are you picturing the ribs of Hussein? Fatima, 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 ya Fatima Zahra. Fatima, 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 ya Fatima, ya Fatima Zahra. If you heard Zainab well, if you heard Zainab well, as Hussein calls for help, Abbas is gone as well. The sun sets in the land of Karban wa Bala. The moon has lost its arms, Zainab has lost Abbas. An angel calls adhan for the resting corpse of Hussein's shuhada. Oh, a أبد والله يا زهرة يا زهرة أبد والله يا زهرة يا زهرة ما ننسى ما ننسى حسينا حسين 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 حسينا ما ننسى حسينا ما ننسى حسينا حسين 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 حسينا فاطمة يا فاطمة 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 يا فاطمة يا فاطمة زهراء فاطمة يا فاطمة 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 يا فاطمة يا فاطمة زهراء صلى على محمد وآل محمد